Thank you everyone for coming. So this series of seminars is called Natural Awakening. So the seminar series is looking at awareness training practices from across all lianas. So Sutrayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and Dzogchen. To look at how awareness training is approached across all of those yanas. And one of the goals for doing that is to show how consistent awareness training is across the yanas, and also to show how traditions that we might think quite far removed from the Buddha's original teaching in the Pali Sutras that actually are not. So things that we might consider uniquely, say, Chinese Chan, Japanese Zen, or Tibetan Mahayana or Dzogchen, we can find the core teachings of those things in the early sutras, the Pali Sutras in particular. So one of the things that we do in pristine awareness is we always teach from the perspective of all lianas. So if we can't find in the early sutras a core or seed of something that appears in a later yana, we don't focus on that. It's not to say that those things aren't pure and perfect. All methods, all yanas, all traditions are pure and perfect. It's just that our particular focus is to focus on the simplicity evident in all of those yanas. And so the early sutras, the Mahayana, Chan and Zen, Mahayana, Dzogchen. So we focus on the things that are simple, things that are easy to access, the things that are free. That's an important part of what we're trying to do. And the things that don't require empowerment, that don't require permission, because they appear in all of the yanas. Anything that appears in all of the yanas can't possibly require empowerment or permission. It's all open. And we come from a position of the Buddha's own statement in the early Pali Sutras, where he said, "There is nothing secret. I have held nothing back. I am not a miserly storekeeper who's held something behind my back." Words to that effect. I have given you everything that there is. If I have not given it to you, it isn't there. So we very much follow that idea that there is nothing secret, that the Buddha gave everything, and therefore when we look at things that are in the later yanas, we look for their antecedent in the early sutras. And today we have not found them. They are there. This shows kind of the unity, the beautiful continuity, and the complete lack of division, really, when you look in terms of the practice. There's some division around view, obviously, some division around style, approach, but in terms of the practice, this has been consistent from the early sutras to now. And as we're a practice-focused organization, we're focused on that. All right, so as I said, these awareness training practices, they appear first in, again, remember we're talking about the Pali Sutras, but they also have been replicated in the Sanskrit Sutras, the Mahayana Sutras. So it's not that they're not there in the Sanskrit Sutras, they are certainly there. And there are some Mahayana texts translated around the 4th century that repeat these teachings from the early sutras. So in the Satipatthana Sutra in particular, apologies if I've butchered the name of that sutra, the Buddha goes through in elaborate detail these awareness training practices. So he goes through them in, some people think that he goes through them in a way that is meant to be progressional. So you do this first, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. But actually, they're not meant to be understood that way. You can do this and none of the others. Like, he's actually laying out options. And in the oral tradition, so not necessarily in the textual tradition, there's an understanding that different kinds of people with different personalities will respond better to different kinds of things, different kinds of awareness training. So, and that's there early, in the early tradition. So at first it's sort of divided into extrovert and introvert. They're the two main sort of divisions that we see. And so the Buddha is giving options for extroverts and introverts. And the reason being, the Buddha taught that introverts have a different, in terms of how they perceive what arises in the mind, but also how quickly they perceive what arises in the mind. And extroverts, again, they perceive what arises in the mind slightly differently, and the degree to how quickly they see it is different. So introverts are a little slower to see things changing in the mind. Extroverts see things more quickly as they change in the mind. So he's given options for different kinds of people. And then that's expanded out into people who have, you know, there's multiple different kinds of disposition. And then these different practices work with each of them. So basically, the idea for this seminar series is to introduce you to all of them, and that you would find one that you love and that you would do that. The idea is not, they can be approached as a progression, and there are some things that need to certainly be done first, but they don't have to be approached as a progression. You can choose the one that resonates with you very deeply, and you can just do that. That's enough, you know. And then just as a little sidebar, so the Buddha taught shamatha, calm abiding meditation, and vipassana, these awareness training practices, separately. But in the sutras where he teaches shamatha, he makes it quite clear that in shamatha, vipassana arises naturally. So it just happens naturally through shamatha. And in, I've said this multiple times before, so if the heart is open, if we sit in shamatha, then everything evolves naturally. So vipassana evolves naturally, insight into the nature of mind and reality evolves naturally, and then triksha, the ability to see through the illusion nature of things, that happens naturally, and then Tiger visions arise naturally. Dewey Kensey said this in one of his seminars he gave a long time ago in the 80s as well, and so it's not just us saying this. Shamatha is the core of all Buddhist practice, and if you do it with an open heart, everything evolves naturally. So that's another option. So even though we're talking about vipassana separately to shamatha, it's important to understand that these things are not really different, and in the Mahayana tradition and in the Dzogchen tradition, they're practiced as one. So it's kind of important to get that we're talking about them somewhat separately, but they are not really separate if they're approached with an open heart. So that being said, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the yanas, the vision, not the yanas themselves, but how these things are approached in the yanas. And then in the following seminars, we'll zoom in on those particular styles. My, just as a humble kind of like opinion, I feel that the way these awareness training practices are taught in the early sutras is preferable to the way they're taught in later traditions, so in the Mahayana, Vajrayana and Dzogchen traditions. That being said, you do see in the Dzogchen same-day tradition exactly what the early sutras are suggesting that you do, exactly, and in the same order. In the more tantra-infused Dzogchen traditions, where you start to see visualization, seed syllables, things like that, being used in these awareness training practices, that's quite a step away from Garib Dorje's original model, and a step away from the early sutras, and also a step away from how the Chan and the Zen practitioners have done this historically over time. So it's actually kind of interesting that all of the traditions are very, very similar, except for Tantra. Tantra makes a departure from the tradition. And the reason for that is unique to the Tibetan environment, the Tibetan situation, and the Tibetan mindset. That being said, if that's the thing that calls to you, do it that way. There's no problem there. All right, so first off, in the Sutrayana, in the Satipatthana Sutra, the Buddha talks about, there's a number of translations of this sutra. If you want to go to the original, I recommend you do that, but I'll send out by email sections of the sutra because it's a little long, that zero in on these particular practices. And the important thing to remember is that the sutras were written down, the Pali sutras were written down a couple of hundred years after the Buddha passed into parinirvana. So they're recollections of an oral tradition that's been going on. But the practice itself, the practices themselves, have been handed down from teacher to student in an unbroken line from the time of the Buddha. So the textual record, it isn't a step-by-step, do this, then do this, then do this, then do this. It's kind of a recollection. But you will note that across the world in all the Buddhist traditions, shamatha, vipassana are all taught essentially the same way, because that oral lineage is unbroken. So there's some things that are not in the textual account that have been handed down from the time of the Buddha that I think are elucidated when we look at the different traditions and how they do them. They've picked up one aspect and run with it. That's all good. The picking up one aspect and running with it was kind of what the Buddha intended, I think. So each tradition focuses on what was kind of relevant and workable for their culture. So that's why we get these kind of differences. But if you look at the root of it, it's all essentially the same. Okay, so in the early sutras, there's a number of them, but that Satipatthana Sutra is the main one, where the traditions over time have drawn on those teachings to get practice advice. So those of you who've received Dzogchen teachings and have received Kode Rushen teachings in particular, you'll recognize this straight away. So in the early sutras, the Buddha says, first, you become aware, and the word aware is repeated hundreds of times in that sutra. So it's not mindful, it's not concentrate, it's not observe, watch, it's be aware. And awareness, as I think some of you might know, is the root of the word bodhicitta. So when we talk about bodhicitta, we're talking about an awareness that is co-emergent with compassion. Empty awareness, it's co-emergent with compassion. So that kind of Sanskrit or Pali word that is translated into awareness, it doesn't mean to concentrate, to watch, to observe. It means to relax into the state of awareness. And in this sutra, the Buddha talks about, go through these steps, and then he talks about the 7 factors of awakening, which also I'm often talking about. And the 7 factors of awakening are stages to awakening, but they're also tools. So they are the stages to awakening, but also you can use them as tools. So you can pick out each of these factors and you can use them as a practice to become awakened. And in that set, none of the things we might expect are there. So, renunciation is not there. But joy is there. And relaxation is there. And when the word that's used for relaxation is not, Jamming and I have talked about how to put this. It's not like a spiritual relaxation, some kind of spiritual thing. It's just simply to be relaxed, to just be relaxed. Simple, ordinary relaxation. It's on the list of an essential ingredient to awakening, also an essential step to awakening. You become relaxed. So, you cultivate relaxation in order to become awakened. So, and joy is there as well. And the word for joy in this sutra is not mudita. Mudita is appreciative joy. Joy in other people's happiness, other people's accomplishments, other people's well-being. This is just bodily joy, not with no referent. It's just joy. It's sometimes translated as rapture, just this blissful joy, but it's not about others. It's just a state of the mind, it's just a state of the mind. So in this sutra, the Buddha talks about this awareness training, and he says if you do this, then it will evolve from, basically calm abiding through to recognition of the illusory nature of phenomena, and then joy rises and relaxation, and so there's these factors, which I can also send you out the list. But anyway, in these sutras, he does, again, those of you who've received teachings on Court evolution, it's the same. So you go through the elements, and in the early sutras, you start with the elements as they're felt in the body, right? So as an example, the earth is the solidity of the body. When we're sitting on our cushion, there's a solidity there. There's a weight there. There's a firmness there. So we sit and we are aware of that solidity. And then water is the moisture of the body. So like our blood, but also our sweat, and just the fact that when we touch our skin, it's not all dry and brittle, unless it's winter and you haven't been moisturizing, So you touch and you can feel the moist nature of the body, and in the mouth there's water, in the eyes there's water. So the water element is in the body, and you are aware of that. And then, so you go through the elements in that way in terms of awareness of the feeling tone of them, how it feels to be an embodiment of the elements. And then you don't do that in a way that entrenches them as permanent. You do that in a way that recognizes the impermanence of them. So you recognize that the elements come into being and dissolve of their own accord without us having any power or control over it. And that's true in the body too. These elements come together to form the body, but they will come apart again when we pass away. And also in every moment, like air enters and leaves the body, and the warmth that we feel goes up and down. We're sometimes hot, we're sometimes perfectly fine in terms of temperature, and sometimes we're cold. That's the fire element in the body, fluctuating, changing. So the point of being aware, and this is not to sort of like concentrate hardly, focus intently on this. It's just to be gently aware of these elements in the body, and you can do one at a time. So you can do, and if you've had Court evolution teachings, that's how they do it, one at a time. And in the early sutras also, they do it that way, one at a time. You can do the elements one at a time. But the difference in the way these things are set up is that in the tantric tradition, they talk about purifying the elements. You go through the elements in order to purify them. And this idea is not in the early sutras, that the elements need to be purified. It's not there at all. This idea is not there in Zen. It's not there in Chan. It's not there in Dzogchen, because there's nothing to purify. Everything's already innately pure. Why? Because it rises out of emptiness. It abides in emptiness, and it dissolves back into emptiness. All pure at every step. All perfect at every step. Perfect. Why? Because it can't be any other way. There's no other way for it to be. That's how it is. So it's perfect because there's no other way for it to be. So, but in Tantra, they talk about purifying elements. It's the only situation where these awareness training practices deviate from just this idea of just being gently aware and just letting them come and go in their own way, because that's what they will do. In the early sutras, there's a focus on the impermanence and on the empty nature of it. So in the Mahayana, the focus on the empty space-like nature of the elements, sort of underneath the solidity, there's space, underneath the water element, there's space. Underneath the fire element, there's space. You know, we all know that if you take air out of a room, a fire will extinguish itself. You know, so in the Mahayana tradition, they really focus on the space element. And that's why we see in the Mahayana tradition, they tend to do these meditations at particular times of days when things are going from light to dark, so they can emphasize the impermanent sort of nature of it, but also they tend to do them looking at the horizon. So there's a sense of space there already in the whole process. So I'm just giving an overview now. We'll dive deep into these things as we proceed. But then, of course, in the sutras and in the Mahayana tradition and in the Dzogchen tradition, but not in the Tantra tradition, they then move on to the senses. So your eye, your ear, your mouth, your sense of touch, your sense of smell. So then you move through those and you become gently aware of these things, right? In the, you know, the great thing about the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition is that it gives a very simple way of thinking about this, very simple. Whereas in the early sutras, it's a little bit more complicated because they go through each and every component of the mind, you know? So, but in the Dzogchen, they just go, okay, so there's dualistic mind and there's Rigpa, true nature of mind. That, you know, so just simplify it that way. But in the early sutras, we get the idea is that you look at something, and again, you choose an element. So you're going through the elements still. So you've done the thing where you've recognized the elements in the body, you've recognized the impermanent nature of them, that they come and they go, and then you're looking at an object with your eyes. And this is also exactly the same in outer Rushen. So then you're looking at an object with your eyes, and you are gently aware of the object, the form, right? You're gently aware of the feeling tone. There's no other real way to say it. The feeling you get from looking at that thing. So the feeling tone is like a basic non-verbal reaction, you know? So you might, if you're looking at puppies, oh, there's a non-verbal oh feeling tone about puppies, you know? But if you're looking at an open sewer, it's like, ooh, there's a ooh feeling tone. You know, the feeling tone is different. So it's to be aware of the feeling tone that arises when looking at the object, and then to be aware of the perceptual intervention, where your thinking mind comes in and goes like, dislike. Then, you know, labels puppies, sewage, you know, puppies, good, cute, lovely, and all the chain of associations that flow from that. And sewage, smelly, bad, dirty, diseased, all the chain of associations that rise from that. So in the early sutras, you go through sense by sense. This is true also in Chan and Zen. They do exactly the same thing through senses, sense by sense, eye, ear, throat, nose. And then in Dzogchen, same, sense by sense. They go through element. They do element. It's element and sense combined in the Rushen teachings. So, for example, if you're doing, you would use your eyes, and then you would look at a mountain for the earth element. You would use your eyes and look at the sky for the air element. You would use your eyes and look at a candle flame or a lamp for the fire element. You would use your eyes and you look at a lake for the water element, right? And then you are aware of the feeling tone. You're aware of the form constructed by the sense, you know. So first you're aware that there's something constructed by the sense faculty. Then you're aware of the feeling tone that construction creates. Then you're aware of your reaction to that feeling tone and the form, the object that's been created. So, and in the sort of Chan, Zen, Mahamudra, Dzogchen kind of style, it's much simpler than that. Sort of like each element has to be identified and understood, you know. It's just divided into two, really. There's the fabrication and the real, you know. So everything that is in those early steps in the early sutra, the feeling tone the form object itself created by the sense, the feeling tone, and then the perceptual things that arise, they're all categorized as dualistic fabrication. So just one label for all of them. And what remains is the awareness, the natural bare awareness, Ripa. So in the early sutras, the Buddha says, in the translation by Thich Nhat Hanh, it goes, she is aware. She is aware of this. 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 So it goes down the list of the things that she is aware of. In other translations, they've used the word monk. So the monk is aware, the monk is aware, the monk is aware, the monk is aware. So if you read it like that, and this is a problem of translation between Pali and European languages, right? There's no way to translate that sense of gentle awareness without linking it to a subject, he, she, etc. But if we undertake this practice, eventually the subject dissolves completely. So you see sometimes, like actually in the Lukang, I think it's called, the Dalai Lama's secret temple in Lhasa, on the second level, there are these paintings of these practices of yogis sitting. That's the Dalai Lama's Dzogchen temple. They call it secret temple because the Lukas don't like to admit that he was the Dalai Lama's practice Dzogchen. So there are paintings of yogis sitting by a waterfall, so they're using the ear sense, listening to the water, and they're doing this practice, these awareness training practices. And there's images of yogis looking at the sky, etc. So there's all these images of yogis doing this in the Lukang, quite beautiful. But my point about that is, eventually, the awareness becomes prominent, and the fabrication, so the form object, the perception that the eye or the ear is constructing, fabricating, and the feeling tone that one gets from that, and then the verbal thinking that arises from that, they dissolve. They start to dissolve. I think the phrase is like a snake's tail unknotting in the sky. Just naturally happens. So, and then the self dissolves, because the self is built on the sense perception, eyes, ears, nose, throat, touch, etc., and the feeling tones, and then the verbal thinking that happens. That's the self. The self is nothing other than that. So that as that all starts to dissolve, because of awareness, simply by placing our awareness on these things, we see their dissolution, and then they dissolve more quickly, more rapidly, without any kind of intervention. And then the self too, because the self is built on that stuff, the self too dissolves. And there are these paintings in the Lukang that show like the yogi meditating on the wind, who feels like they've become like a lattice. The wind is just going straight through, you know. So there's a lattice drawn on the yogi's chest. It's sort of like just this sense of like the wind is just going straight through, and self is not there anymore. You know, there's just the wind now. And then as you proceed, then even the wind dissolves into space, and then there's just spacious awareness, you know. It's kind of profound and full on that these practices are so sort of simple, and they're there in the early sutras, and they have been undertaken in this way for nearly 3,000 years, or depending on like the new dating puts it at about 3,500 years, because they found a Buddhist temple underneath another temple that pushes the Buddha's birthday back by about 600 years. So it's kind of amazing that the living practice of these awareness trainings has been handed down such a long time in a completely unadulterated way. It's really kind of extraordinary. And you could see the seed of them in the textual evidence, you know, over the centuries. But there's always been things that, because of the nature of translation, can't be directly put in our language. So you need to learn from someone who's done it, someone who knows how to do this stuff. And then that's, you know, why we have teachers, why I have a teacher, and why we all have a teacher, if we have a teacher. But, you know, Thomas and Barbie is all our teacher. So this is kind of extraordinary. And the thing that I think is most beautiful about this is that it's our birthright. It's free. It's there in the sutras. There's no empowerment needed. There's no initiation needed. There's no restriction on this stuff. So, and in the way that we will be talking about it here, I won't be talking about the practices in the Tibetan tradition that are restricted, but I will be talking about their direct correlations in Zen, Chan, and the early sutras. And let me just say, they're exactly the same. They're exactly the same. So, so, you know, it's a mystery to me why they became secret. On that, I'd like to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. So, so my feeling is that if you undertake these awareness training practices without a foundation of shamatha, they simply won't work. And so there's the risk there that people who have not got that foundation would then go, this doesn't work, and then go around telling people, oh, that doesn't work. It's nonsense, it doesn't work, you know. So it's a little bit like, well, although the Buddha didn't like this idea, because he said this very clearly, I have held nothing back, there is nothing secret. He was very firm about that. However, in our own spiritual marketplace, we can see how people attend one retreat and then they're yogis, you know, they grow their hair and they're yogis and they're teaching this stuff without any experience in it. And then the people they're teaching, there's no live transmission. Why? Transmission's not a mystical thing, it's real. If there's no transmission, which means that person hasn't done it and hasn't seen directly how it works, then the words that they say are just words. And we're all quite smart as sentient beings. And when we hear words, we might get some inkling of they know some information, but heart won't light up, you know? There's two reasons why when we hear a teaching, the heart doesn't light up. One is we don't have a connection to that person teaching or that teaching itself. The other is that person's not grounded in this stuff. There's nothing coming through, you know? So I think that's why it's important that the foundation's laid, because if you try to do these sorts of practices, even the sutra stuff, you know, and the Buddha makes very clear in that sutra, you must begin with impermanence. You must, you know, because if you do these kinds of practices in the Hindu way, and again, the Hindu tradition has similar sorts of practices, to see the elements as the sort of like eternal, endless manifestations of the divine, you know, then that concretizes the self, because of course they believe in a self that migrates from body to body. They believe in that. We do not believe in that, you know. So it can concretize that idea and trap the person in that way of seeing and looking, you know. But if you really get impermanence and the empty nature of things, in these particular sutras, they're talking about not emptiness in the grand way, but in the not self way, nothing can adhere to a self because there isn't one. There's no owner of these experiences, you know. So without that, and the calm abiding as a kind of to provide space in the mind, so you actually can see as things rise, you can see as things abide, and you can see as things dissolve. Without that space in the mind that calm abiding gives, and the relaxation, you don't see anything rising in the mind. It's just you know. This feeling we have of being us, it's because we haven't done enough shamatha, you know. If you have a sense of being you, and there's just you, it's because there's no space, because there's no shamatha as a foundation. When you do for shamatha, the space between what is you, which is its fabrication, is observable. Awareness is there in that space. And then when you do these kinds of practices, focusing on the elements and then the senses, there's no self. You know, I mean, you might still be quite clearly a self. You might still strongly identify with that. But that hold is loose, you know. So when you're experiencing the sort of these things, there's less grasping. I think that's really sort of important. Anyway, I wanted to give a slightly vague overview, which I think I've done, because I didn't want to get sort of too into it until we can actually sit in those individual traditions and treat them seriously. This is sort of, I've given an overview which sort of has blended everything in together, and it's like, oh, they're all the same, and they're all this and they're all that. That's true, but we have the choice of going with the Sutrayana way of doing this, of going with the Chan way of doing this, of going with the Zen way of doing this, of going with the Mahamudra way of doing this, or going with the Dzogchen way of doing this. That is a choice. There's no high or low here. Everything the Buddha taught leads to liberation. Everything. Each individual practice in and of itself is enough. You know, as I said, shamatha will do it if you have an open heart. Likewise, these awareness practices or vipassana practices, which then become trecha, toil, etc., they will do it on their own. So it's about, as a first step, trying to level these things out so they're all treated equally, so that we can abandon this idea of high and low, because that is poison. You know, it's a very it's a very tantric idea, high and low, pure and impure. It's not there in the early sutras. Obviously, people often think that the focus on purification in the Mahayana tradition is a direct outgrowing of the renunciation in the sutras, but I would suggest that it is not. In this, because the Buddha in multiple places said luminous is the nature of the mind, luminous is the nature of the world. You know, in one sutra it says, focused on the purity on which you and the world are founded. You know, this is in the sutras. He didn't advocate all these purification practices at all. He advocated 3 simple things: meditation, which can be divided into shamatha and vipassana; wisdom, which is impermanence, emptiness, Buddha nature. And I mean, I'll talk about these 4 seals. All conditioned things are impermanent. All dualistic mind states are suffering. All things are free of inherent self-nature. Nirvana is non-dual and perfect peace. So those are what we call the 4 Dharma seals, or the 4 great seals. Those are the only things that you have to believe as a Buddhist. All of the other things, rebirth, karma, purification, all these other things. You do not have to believe them. In fact, millions of Buddhists do not. There's 6 million Buddhists in India who don't believe in life-to-life karma. The Advaita Buddhists. They don't believe in that. You know, they're the biggest Buddhist community in India. They don't believe in that. All of the differences between schools arose around differences on 2 things: karma and rebirth. Then later, some differences arose around what emptiness really means. There's no differences otherwise. That's where the differences are, which tells us what? You can have a difference. You can have a difference if you want. There's all these schools that are different from each other, and it's okay. You know, the only thing the Buddha said was, death is not an end. That's as hard as he would make his line, you know. So when we're talking about rebirth and stuff like that, like what did the Buddha teach? He kind of said, along with karma, it was a bit imponderable, but it is not an end. Death is not an end, you know. And then in another place, when he talked about the times we could become enlightened, one of those times we could become enlightened is in between death and a new life. So he clearly pointed to a bardo, a state in between, and clearly indicated that something persists, you know, not the self. That's a fabrication. It cannot persist, but something does. Anyway, so I've just given you a very vague overview. Hopefully it will have sparked your curiosity, and we can have a little Q&A after a bit of a break. We'll do a 5-minute break or something like that, and then we'll come back and then we'll do a Q&A. I'm not going to record the Q&A because I don't want your faces and voices on the internet, although I don't think I'll put this on the internet. So if you just have a little bit of a break and think about what you might like to ask. So you can ask about the sutra stuff, the Mahayana stuff. I am fairly familiar with the Chan stuff. Zen is not my gig. Done some learning in that space, but if it's Zen stuff you want to know about, I might not have the answers. And Mahayana and Dzogchen, obviously those things we can talk about too. So just think about what you would like to ask, and also give me a sense of, in terms of practices, what are your natural tendencies? What are your passions? You know, so as an example, just as a little example, before we go break, I always, as a child, was very elated by the wind. You know, if it was windy, I would run outside and just be in the wind, and I'd be just so elated to be in the wind. The stronger the wind, the better. And other people go, oh my God, it's so windy, let's get inside. And I'm like, no, I love it. You know, so, and other people are like, the water, that's their thing. They love the water. Other people are like, they like to sit on the ground in the sun or in a forest. You know, we all have a thing. And these teachings imply that that's where we start, with that natural tendency. And so, because in those 7 factors of awakening, joy and relaxation are really prominent. So we have to make sure that in the practices we do, that it evokes joy, that it causes us to feel relaxed and content, you know, because a content mind doesn't cling. It wants nothing more. It's content, you know. A relaxed mind isn't agitated. It's not anxious. Quite simple. Likewise, a joyful mind is a spacious mind. There's no anxiety there. There's no trauma there. There's no panic there. There's no clinging there. There's no jealousy there. There's no hatred there. There's no anger there. It's just joy. There can only be one thing in the mind at a time. So think about that. What are your natural leanings in terms of the elements, you know? Also, what are your natural leanings in terms of your senses? Most of us are visual people, which is why a lot of the practices taught are visual. Like look at a mountain, look at the ocean, look at the sky. That's why, because most of us are very visual beings, but some of us are auditory more. And so for those people, sit by a waterfall, sit in a grove of trees and listen, and some of them more tactile, touchy. And so that it can be sitting in the sun, sitting in the wind, lying on the ground, in different situations. So like on grass or at the beach on sand or on a warm rock, think about what your natural tendencies are. Because in the Vajrayana Tantra, it says, use that which pulls you down to rise up. That which pulls us down, that means that which deepens our sense of self. And often when we're in these states where we're just elated by the sun or the wind or something, our sense of being ourselves is quite acute, So the Vajrayana Tantra says, use that. Find out what that is and use that, All right, we'll have a 5-ish minute break and we'll come back and then we'll do Q&A. So I'll stop the recording now. And then after the Q&A, we can, we'll do a very quick dedication. All right. You can also, if you don't want to speak, you can send questions through the chat. All right. We'll be back in exactly 5 minutes.